Welcome to Year 2 of StriverraTV Reviews. To celebrate, I welcome you to the inaugural edition of Fastball, a different kind of review than usual, where I'll tell you about a cheap and short game that's still worth your money and your time, in under 10 minutes. Let's begin. Today's game is Spec Ops: The Line, released in 2012 for Xbox 360, PS3, Microsoft Windows, and in 2014 for Mac OS X. At face value, it seems pretty generic. It's a third-person cover-based shooter starring 3 highly trained American military personnel. One thing that sets it apart right away is the setting. It takes place in a modern-day Dubai, ravaged by a series of horrible sandstorms and other natural disasters. The juxtaposition of a rich city destroyed by the elements is well done, and makes the environment highly unique from other shooters. The wealthy have already evacuated, but thousands of locals and migrant workers are stuck in their destroyed utopian city. The protagonist's former CO and his unit, the 33rd Infantry Battalion, volunteered to oversee the civilian evacuation. Some months later, the protagonist named Walker and his 2 Special Forces buddies, Lugo and Adams, are sent in by the government covertly to see how the evacuation is going. Things go to shit in record time, and this is where Spec Ops gets pretty unique. As you play, Walker's mental health begins to deteriorate, and that reflects in a manner of ways in both gameplay and story. The game almost becomes self-aware at times and forces the player to make terrible split-second moral choices, with the options usually being bad or worse. You'll commit some pretty brutal acts through the story, and I'm not kidding when I say that I don't think this is for the faint of heart. The story ultimately ends up a brutal, beautiful, and depressing tragedy about the horrors of war, which is a theme that lots of games are kind of afraid to explore, or attempt to, and fall flat. The other members of your squad will show the effects of the game's story too. They stop speaking professionally and just start screaming during battle, not to mention their arguing, which gets much worse as the game goes on. I can't really say too much more without spoiling things, and this is a game you'll really want to go into as blind as possible. The graphics are pretty damn alright for 2012. Not as good as, say, Mass Effect 3 or Max Payne 3, but that could be chalked up to budgetary reasons and development team size. The lip sync suffers from time to time, and some textures shouldn't be looked at too closely, but it's absolutely not an eyesore, especially the wide open vistas of the beautiful, chaotic city. I literally didn't know this until I started playing, but Nolan North voices the protagonist. He gives an absolutely stellar performance as usual, and it was actually pretty nice to hear him play a vastly different character to others he's played in the past. Bruce Boxleitner voices Walker's former CO, who you hear a lot from throughout the story, and he absolutely kills it as well. The supporting cast all have great delivery and emotion too. The voice acting across the board is a selling point for the game as far as I'm concerned.
Anyone else feel like we should try talking to these guys again? I mean, we did come here to save them.
Man, we are way past that point. These people don't want to talk, they're out for blood.
Lugo's right. Best we can do is get out of here and find the 33rd, before these people tear them apart.
Okay, shoot first, questions later. Got it.
We find Conrad, he'll answer our questions.
I also heard a familiar voice among enemy troops. In one Google search later, I found out that Paul Eating, i.e. the Colonel from Metal Gear, or Grandpa Max from Ben 10, lends his talent for some nameless enemy NPCs. Pretty cool. The music is a combo of licensed tracks and the original score, and the original score is this kind of generic heavy metal. Not like Doom 2016 heavy metal, but pretty good nonetheless. It fits the tone perfectly and enhances the action sequences at least twofold. The sound effects are alright, I wish the gunfire was a bit more realistic, but you hardly have time to complain being serenaded by Nolan North. The game runs fine, no two ways about it. It never crashed, it loaded quick, and ran fine through Steam. Only complaint is the frequency of the loading screens, but you gotta keep in mind it was made for consoles, which at the time needed these frequent loading screens to keep things moving. At least they're quick enough, so I'll give it a pass. The gameplay absolutely feels generic, but I honestly think it was done on purpose. It feels familiar to shoot enemies, almost dehumanizing them, serving the game's story and progress. Not to say it's bland, because it's not. There's a good variety of weapons to play around with, and some have special modes like attaching a suppressor, an underbarrel grenade launcher, or toggleable burst fire modes. The environments are also interactable in certain places. Given that the city is choked by sand, sometimes windows or barriers can be shot out to release a bunch of it and crush enemies or clear paths. Overall, the gameplay is familiar, but unique enough to set itself apart from other third-person cover shooters. It certainly gets the job done. Now, I want to address the one criticism I have of this game's story before you go thinking it's a perfect 10 out of 10. It's not as interactive as it could be. Let me explain. In this game, there's never really a choice to any of the choices. I say it that way because no matter what you do, the game is nearly identical across playthroughs, excluding the ending, which is decided in the final chapter, not as a accumulation of your choices throughout the story. I think the hardest hitting, most extreme parts of the story would have hit a lot harder if there were actually a choice involved. But at the end of the day, the actual choice the player makes, not your character, but you, in your chair at home, controller or keyboard at hand, is to keep playing or turn the game off. And that's cool in the game's context, but kinda lame compared to an actual choice between two morally gray options with reasonably justifiable motives for either. Knowing this, it exposes the game's true colors of a linear game, hiding behind the well-presented facade of one with true moral decisions. At the end of most action games, if you ask yourself, do I feel like a hero yet? You'll probably say yes, but not this time. Spec Ops: The Line handles very, very dark themes of PTSD, violence, human nature, mental illness, and the brutalities of war in a pretty graphic and real way, without ever feeling in bad taste. In this way, it almost feels like an open criticism of other shooters, where mindlessly gunning down hundreds of enemies leaves the protagonist no different from where they started. But not here. I got Spec Ops: The Line for $6 and beat it in about 4 hours. Cheap, short, and well worth the money and the time. So grab it for yourself with all that in mind, and ask yourself, do I feel like a hero yet?